In this video, I'm going to walk you through how you can fix and eliminate low back pain and low back tightness forever. And this is going to be the conceptual version of this part 3 series where we talk about the rib cage and pelvic alignment, which is the foundation of any and all core stability. And a little bit on my backstory. I've had several back injuries and neck injuries over the course of my life. In middle school, I had a lot of low back stress fractures because I was arching in through my lower back to get rebounds. I also have had 2 neck sprains, one from surfing, one by getting rear-ended by a trolley. And those have led to me having a lot of low back pain. But what I didn't realize was that my core wasn't working as a symphony. I didn't have this rib cage pelvic alignment that I'm about to show you. And when I created this, my core transformed forever, my pain was eliminated, and I ultimately became stronger for it. So my goal by the end of this video is to help you understand the concept of keeping your rib cage stacked over your pelvis so that you can maintain a neutral spine and maintain a strong spine that isn't in an anterior pelvic tilt, that isn't arching in the low back, that isn't flaring your rib cage throughout a number of different movements, both in the gym and throughout daily life. And now, it's not to say that you have to keep a neutral spine at all given moments. Throughout any athletic endeavor, your spine will move a number of different ways, but this is the best way to reinforce that stability. So the first thing I'll have you consider is that there are more than just the abs that make up the core. And I used to think that it was just the six-pack or just the obliques that determined whether or not your core was strong. But there's around 29 different muscles that will attach at any given point to the rib cage, to the pelvis, and to your spine. And anything that touches those bones is ultimately going to impact your core because they all work as a symphony. So you might have thought of the rectus abdominis, which is the abs, but there's also the internal obliques, the transverse abdominis, the diaphragm, which is what is moving as you breathe, your pelvic floor. That's all working underneath your deeper core. Then you have your glutes, you have your lats, you have your serratus anterior. These are all working together, and when they work as a symphony, your core is much stronger, your core is much more stable, and those muscles and those joints can be at the joint length tensions that they need and want to be in order for you to be strong, in order for you to be safe. But if they're not working together, it's like an 8th grade band, and your low back feels the brunt of it. So what do I mean when I'm talking about a rib cage pelvic alignment? Well, right now, if I go to a side profile view, my rib cage is stacked over my pelvis. And where a lot of people run into problems is that rib cage starts to flare out, and it is now at this angle, not stacked over the pelvis. The low back is doing a lot more work. The erectors specifically, this anterior core, the front side is not as engaged. That leads to tight hip flexors, leads to tight low back. Glutes aren't doing their job. Anterior core is not doing its job. And so this would be what you would call an anterior pelvic tilt, where your low back is arching, your chest is flared out, ribs are flared out. This is going to cause a lot of back pain. But when you pull it down, this stays stacked. Now my core can work as one unit. Another example where people run into pain is what I call video game butt, where you're basically sitting in this posture, really long and extended in that low back lumbar area. So now my erectors are constantly being pulled on, and this is a posture that people will sit in all day. And if you have this position or you have this position, I call this almost like stripper butt, both of these are losing that connection of that rib cage being stacked over the pelvis. So when you have that, it doesn't matter if I'm going into a squat. It doesn't matter if I'm hinging. It doesn't matter if I'm pressing overhead. I want to keep that rib cage stacked over that pelvis as much as I can. And it's through functional breathing, it's through core training and not just working your abs that you're going to enable the brain and the central nervous system to say, okay, when we need to move through any athletic movement, when we need to move throughout our day, we are going to reinforce and keep this position tight and activated so that it's not just being sent to that low back. So here's a few of the most common exercises and what good form looks like and what you want to make sure that you're avoiding. When you understand and grasp this concept, now you have awareness, now you can start to make the changes. And that's what we're gonna cover in part 3 of this series, so make sure and stay tuned. So if I'm gonna go and do a back squat, I get up underneath the bar, I wanna make sure rib cage is pulled down so that as I go through a squat, I'm keeping that same tension, boom to boom, that length doesn't change. What would be the wrong version is if I go here, shoot my butt back, now I've got that low back arch, rib cage flared out. If I go to squat here, you can already feel it. Ton of tension and ultimately pain in the compression in that area. Now you can also have the reverse, where you have it tilted almost too far forward in a posterior pelvic tilt, and now you're coming down here. Now I can feel that stretch in my lower back area. That happens a lot at the bottom of a squat, when you no longer have the mobility to get where you want to get, And so that pelvis needs to tuck underneath in order to go deeper. That tugs and pulls on your low back. So you want to maintain that positioning the entire way through. That might mean going a little bit deeper, working on mobility, but ultimately it starts with your rib cage being stacked over the pelvis. Here's another example where you might do this in an overhead press. Now, if I'm overhead pressing, I want to keep rib cage stacked over pelvis. But what happens, especially if someone doesn't have the upper body or the shoulder mobility, is they're going to press, not be able to get there, and now they're trying to find it through the lower back because the shoulders don't have the flexion that they need. They can't get all the way up overhead without that rib cage flaring, and so you compensate there. Now, the most common one that you're going to see is in any hinge movement, so we'll just do a quick RDL. And in this RDL, I want rib cage stacked. The distance between rib cage and pelvis doesn't change the entire way through. What you'll see is someone goes chest out, sends the butt back, but it's really that low back arching. Now it's a ton of pain in that lower back area. You're basically using the erectors for a job they're not supposed to do. Another one that'll happen is as you get here in the deadlift, don't have the ability to pull it up off, so you recruit the erectors, which you've been training through that posture that you have. We'll talk about that in part 2 of this series. But those are all positions that when you find yourself in them, that's going to be what contributes to that lower back pain. But ultimately, it's a posterior tilt of the pelvis or it's an anterior tilt of the pelvis, and that's causing you to pull on a number of different muscles that aren't intended to do that job. Keeping that rib cage stacked over the pelvis is ultimately going to help you create the most strong, functional, and athletic core as you can possibly have. So hopefully this concept of the rib cage being stacked over the pelvis is starting to make sense. And once you understand this concept, now what we talk about in part 2 with the causes and the postural problems that you're running into, you're gonna have so much more awareness for them and you're gonna start to be able to make changes. And then in part 3, we're gonna talk about the specific exercises you can utilize that are gonna help you really start to ingrain that functional core breathing and that functional core pattern so that your core works as a symphony. And this isn't something that you need to consciously be thinking about. Totally get it, it can seem overwhelming, so many things to think about. Once your body starts to do this naturally, that's when you're able to do things without having to worry about your low back being an issue, both in the gym and in day-to-day life. And I know how frustrating this can be. I spent a majority of my 20s icing my neck, going to chiropractors, trying to get my neck and back problems solved. And ultimately, it took me working for 6 months on these exercises that I'm gonna show you in part 3, where all I did was just functional breathing and core exercises to get my core working together again. And I was worried that I was never gonna be able to lift weights. Everything hurt. But this ultimately transformed my core, transformed my body, transformed my spine. I want to help you do the same. Thanks for watching. If you got value out of this video, hit that like and subscribe button. If you got any questions or comments, drop them down below. I'd love to chat with you. My name is Paul Klingen. I'll catch you in the next Return to the Athlete video.